do quickly what I put out as the set number 2, and then take a look a little bit more at number 3, because that will begin this notion of Hevel as breath, as a kind of ontological structure, and it's created. Yes, Leora.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So I noticed in one of the footnotes and around the text, like Hevel is, they're trying to view Hevel positively, and it's a very positive of Hevel. And before reading this, I thought of them as Hevel and Chaim Hevel as a negative thing, as an absence.
No, Hevel here as breath is nothing. We saw at the very, I think, sort of at the beginning of Midrash Qohelet, they really raised the question: is Hevel really Ephes? Is it nothing, or is it correlated with something? Technically, it's breath. In some places in the Bible, sometimes it's related to sheker.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes it's used as a negative acronym for Baal. It's used in other things, but here it's going to be used very positively.
So what,
because of the larger notion that God creates the world through breath and speech. Human beings create existence through breath and speech. And that the breath of study produces realities in the upper worlds, the same way as in other Zohar texts. When you interpret the text, you create multiple universes. So it's a powerfully creative principle. Let's wait till we get to that next text. I just want to pick up on this one text here, which gives us a hint, a little bit more of this flowing dynamic relationship in the deep structure of existence. So let's turn to what you have, number 2. It's from the Zohar. It's from volume 230a, which I put there in the math volume. It's volume 4 from the Pritzker edition. So I want to I'm going to just kind of do this quickly. Someone translate the English, and I'll go over the original text we have. Beginning with Rabbi Abba Patach. Don't forget, when it says Rabbi Abba Patach, he is beginning a new homiletical exposition in relationship to the particular Torah passage or the Pentateuch passage that's being discussed, let's say in this particular case, from the Parsha of Vayera in Genesis. Okay, so let us, that being said, he doesn't just open and begins a new discourse. He's giving a homiletical verse that he's now going to correlate with a whole series of other verses. Okay, so let's, someone want to read Rabbi Abba opened, Patach. Okay, Emily.
Rabbi Abba opened. All the streams flow to the sea, and the sea is not full. To the place the streams flow, there they continue to flow. Okay,
so it looks like a paradox or something of that nature, whatever it is.
This verse has been discussed and explained by the companions. But come and see. When those supernal streams enter the sea, it gathers them, absorbing them, because the waters freeze in the sea, and that continually absorbs all the water entering. Afterward, the water issues through the power of the six, watering all beasts of the field. As is said, they water all beasts of the field.
You're reading very fast for a Zohar reader, Emily. You come from New York or Toronto?
It's Montreal.
Montreal. Either way, it's too fast. Okay, go.
Okay. More slowly this time. Come and see.
Yeah, as Maxine would say, shvoya, shvoya, right? Slow. Okay.
The frozen sea is melted by the power of the seven. As has been
See, it's hard to do it slowly, isn't it, right?
It's very anxiety-provoking. Drawing in all water. Therefore, it is not full. The companions have already been aroused by this. To the place the streams flow, there they continue to flow. Why they continue? Because that river issuing from Eden never ceases, gushing water into the sea. So they continue to flow, flowing again and again ceaselessly. As it continues to flow, in order to water all, a north wind comes, freezing the waters, and a south wind, which is warm, thaws them to flow in every direction. So this sea dwells between these two sides, sustained by them, with ships sailing in every direction.
Okay, so let me just quickly go through the text so you can see the structure. We won't spend as much time on this, but I just want you to see what he is going to be concerned. So Rabbi Abba begins the exposition through the prism of chapter 1, verse 7 of Qohelet. Kol hanechalim, all the streams, right? We have to pay attention to every single word, right? All the streams, because now we're presumably going to be understanding all the streams that flow the divine reality. All these things that we didn't want to put on the board are streams. The 7 lower streams, the 7 days of the week, the 7 havalim. They are ways of talking about the dynamic flow of being, right? The streams, all the streams, kol. We came across the word kol last week with our friend Ibn Latif. Kol hanechalim holchim el hayam. So they go, the nachilim go to the yam. We don't know or have any idea that yam is a symbolic term, or that kol, or all the nachalim, right? We're just reading the text as it looks to our surface eyes, right? V'hayam, that yam, einenu malay. Okay? You can already begin to sense these have become already in the philosophical universe terms, right? The malo is already a term that appears in the Bahir and other kinds of terms. What is the fullness of the total universe, etc., etc. So it's not in Malay. El makom shehanechalim. The makom, every single term you have to hear that the nechalim flow to or go to. Sham hein shavim lalechet. So this seems to be a little perplexing. Wherever they go, they return to go, right? Okay. So what does that mean? What does this whole verse mean at any level? So now let's see how he says. Now again, this will bring us back. So who's speaking now? Is this Rabbi Abba or whoever? This kra, this verse that we just recited from Qohelet of Ecclesiastes, itma, it has been discussed, right? So he's using a rabbinic term. It has been considered, right? It's been considered. Va'amri le'chevraya. And they've discussed this. So he's using a kind of more conventional rabbinic term. They've duped it out. They've kind of figured out what the exegetical meaning of all that is. Aval. Remember? He's going to shift levels. Everybody can figure out more or less what that verse means if you just try and understand the geography of the verse. Aval, I lost my place. Tachazi. So now here you can already see the Zohar making its move. If you were reading the Talmud, what would be the way that you would hear? What would be the phrase? Tashma. Come and hear. Right? Come and hear. But it's not just come and hear, right? Because what is shmata in rabbinic literature? You hear the tradition, it's the oral tradition. Tashma is considered the oral tradition. It's not just oral with AU. Tashma is come to hear the oral tradition that's being passed down, as opposed to something else. Not just come and hear with your ear, but you do hear your ear, the shmata. You come now, when he says tachazi, we're talking about an optical tradition. Come and perceive this. You have to see this with your inner eye. The change is of cultural significance, from the ear to the eye, from the oral to the visual, right? So the text now is not simply transmitted orally and heard in the ear as a living tradition. It has to be perceived, contemplated. Istakla, that's the same. Istakla is like the term, what is a contemplatio. It means to see. It means to perceive with the inner eye. Kadino nachlin alin lego yama. So if I remember correctly, I was. I think he. How did he translate this? Yeah, I don't know why he did this. Maybe he had a different manuscript. So there's a problem here. Matt translates the supernal streams. So if you looked at your text, you see that's not what it says. It says, Nachlin A'alin, when they enter. presumably, either he's creatively amending the text, or he had a manuscript that had ila'in instead of a'alin. But yeah, so it's a big difference, right? But presumably it could be either. When the streams, all right, okay, whatever. But we don't understand that the text is not saying. It could be read both ways. So either when the supernal streams enter, that would be a kind of a composite. When they enter Lago Yama, into the midst of the sea, so he's adding this issue, because now we're going to get a sense. The Yama Nekitlon it, and it takes it, V'sha'ivlon begabe, and it absorbs it. Begin to kafon ma'id, so because it freezes it. V'ahu galida, and it congeals it. Like galida is like ice cream, right? He's speaking Italian. Sha'iv kol maya de'ahalin bay, right? And so it's pumping all this water around. Levatan nafkin maya betukva, and it's sent around to the south, and it waters all the beasts of the field, as we read, and waters all the beasts of the field. Okay, so we still don't know how this is a mystical understanding, right? We still don't know how there's going to be a mystical understanding. So he's going to tell us a little bit more in a second. And this presumably is all Rabbi Abba. So he says, Tachazi. He said, come and see that this Yama, which is pumping all this water, and it holds it, then it's because it is watered and released by the various streams. So there's a kind of congealing and flowing. So part of what he's hinting at, which he's now going to say in a moment, is that we're dealing with the symbolic notion that all of the flow of being can be imagined as nichalim, all the nichalim, and they come into Yam, which is Shechina, right? She is the basin. She is the sea. She is the fullness, right? Shechina contains what has flowed into her. That's why she can be the moon. She receives but doesn't give. Passive, but she's filled with what comes into her. Okay? So the Yam is filled, but the Yam too is a creative element because it's the point of intersection between the supernal worlds and the lower worlds. So it's the lowest realm, but it's also the realm that pour forth their creative energy into our world. Okay, so it's congealing and flowing, and it's never full because it's a dynamic process. So part of the perception he wants the reader to understand is to see being as an ever-flowing, flowing and filling and emptying and congealing and opening up. So that's, he says, "Ubegin kach einenu malei ve'itmar," and for that reason, it's never full. So this is part of this dynamic flow of reality. We can only presume that one were to understand that when he says tachazi, we should understand this in a higher symbolic register. But notice he hasn't said he doesn't clarify and say, this is what we mean by the flow of the dargin up and down below. Right? So this is again this complex notion that what is revealed is concealed, and the concealed is only partially revealed. Right? The deeper concealment is not said. The itmar. Vaha, now notice he's going to now indicate something more. You have to pay attention because this is presumably another voice. Vaha it aruve chevraya. The chevraya was spiritually inspired. Right? It aru means that they were aroused. In other words, this phrase inspired them to a different level of consciousness. Alta iru v'alta oreru et ahava chetechpatz. They were spiritually aroused. This is a technical term for a mystical shift in consciousness. As they are hearing that, that's what the narrator is telling us, that the Chevraya didn't just hear this in geographical terms. And even if you were to think that first level is spiritual, the Chevraya went another step further. El makom shanachalim holchim sham heim shavim lalechet. What is the ta'am of this? And then he goes on to say that it's like the nahar negid nefik me'eden lo psik la'almin. V'hu afik tadir maya liyama, etc., etc. V'la paskin la'almin. So we've now shifted to a mystical statement which still remains encoded in symbolic language. Because the mystic would know he's doing two things simultaneously. When he says that the yam that is flowing, that flows into the world, is the creative principle of the universe. Because what verse is he citing? He's saying, Nahar yotzei me'eden. Right? And that's understood. The Nahar now is flowing from Eden, which is the Shekhinah. Nagid. It's flowing down, and it enters and never ceases forever. Okay? Now, he may have other kinds of insights involved. I won't go into that. But what he has brought us to is this particular perception that the flowing streams that come down from the supernal heights and that flow into the Yam are also the supernal Eden, or the lower Eden in this sense. It's an upper Eden and a lower Eden, but this Shekhinah is the lower Eden, and she flows into existence, our existence, in a continuous way. And there is a kind of congealing and flowing, and an unending flow of being. So I think that this is very, very interesting because it helps us somewhat more into the understanding of the mystical psychology of the Chevraya, right? It helps us perceive that they are understanding this, the flow of energy as streams that are ceaseless in the flow of energy in the world. And that's this itaru. To be aroused by this is to understand now the correlate between this verse and what it's telling us about the deepest truths of existence, understood through the metaphor of the flow, or the ceaseless flow, or that it's flowing from the Eden below. And so he's given us a hint of that. He never has said specifically that these are from the Dargin Ila'in, right? He doesn't say these are from the upper ones. He just says that they were aroused. And so we are led to presume this. Again, it's unclear. The whole truth is not disclosed. But enough is to hint that we're at a different level of consciousness. So again, I raise this question. It's very commonly assumed that the Zohar simply has become an esoteric correlation between Scripture, or a correlation between Scripture and the mystical worlds. But you can see that the teacher won't disclose too much. And how the teacher teaches is through a second-order symbolism, which would either be known or not known. Okay?
Does the Zohar comment on the earlier verses in that particular chapter?
No, it doesn't. I don't know if the Zohar comments on that particular. I don't think so. So, in other words, again, notice that this is a different kind of atomistic exegesis than you have in the Midrash, right? Because now each of the terms are mystical codings, and they are now put in a new dynamic energy, in a new spiritual correlation one with the other. So there's a revealing and a concealing in the revealing. It's not simple by any means. And so those in the know, and those who are not in the know are simply told that there is another dimension, but they don't know what it really means.
I'm not sure how much hangs on this question, but the way it's set up, it looks like exegesis that these mystical truths don't just correlate, but actually are sourced in the verses. Would you say that's how this is being presented?
Yes. Well, say more. How do you understand? I agree.
View this as kind of a mystical, separate tradition, as you presented at the beginning, but we're now correlating and saying, isn't it convenient that there's a coincidence in the biblical text? Not convenient in a disparaging way, or we could say that they're sitting around Itmar, they were told Iyr, and they were moved by these verses, and actually these are the source of these mystical.
It always was a theosophical mystery. They simply were not fully aware of that. In other words, our text is simply a verbalization through images, syntax, and semantics of the dynamic flow of energies in the hidden worlds. Whether they are names or personalities or geographical issues. And you have to get to the point where you enter into that dimension through the language of this text. And presumably, if the Itaru means that they were no longer simply reading it as a text, but they were aroused to understand its deeper inner experience. But again, they haven't told us. They don't tell you that directly that Eden is the same as Yam, or what they mean, or that it's Shekhinah, or that it's a flowing, etc., etc.
I guess a way that I would formulate my question more strongly would be: is there a mystical exegetical method that one could take a verse and use to articulate its metaphysical truth, or its mystical truth, or these kind of impositions?
You have to perceive it and then see whether it works. Now, sometimes when the Hebraya are debating with each other, their corrections is that they have different perceptions of the flow of the supernal truths into relationship with each other as they read the syntax or the images of the sentence.
Right, so their mystical tradition corrects their reading rather than their...
Look, I think there is a certain deep structure of what the hierarchy of mystical truth is. How that plays itself out in the flow and syntax of the verse depends on your level of consciousness and awareness. But to be fully aroused by it would mean that you enter into that mystical flow through your study and reading of the text, which it always is, but you didn't understand it in that particular language. So it's more than symbolic. It doesn't stand, it's not symbolic of that, it is that. Right? You have to, it's symbolic in the sense that you can recode certain terms, but it's not a symbol that you know, it's a symbol that you experience, because it is a reality. So I'm using the language symbol, but it is a mythic dimension or a spiritual mystic dimension that you enter into or become part of through exegetical consciousness. So we might understand that what Rabbi was saying, this is the problem of the text, and this is the way it seems to go, and this is the way one might visualize it. And then all of a sudden, we have this third level of itaru. They became spiritually transcendent. They went beyond themselves, and they entered into that flow. And that the language itself is its truth. And its truth is the deepest truth of being. And they're giving us a hint that that's how they are experiencing the exegesis. So there's, again, as I said, at that level, there's no separation between the interpretive act and what is happening. And they're experiencing one way of experiencing mystical unfolding through this particular verse. Right? That's all I think I could say about that.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up in a slightly different way. Who's being aroused, and are different people being aroused in different ways? I mean, it's Shimon Bar Yochai that's being aroused, or whoever.
No, I think it's the ha it aruve chevraya, that the chevraya were aroused by the verse.
By the verse.
By the verse. In and through that study, they became spiritually transposed.
Right, but you're reading the description of the experiential arousing of the chevra, who are being aroused within a communal brotherhood.
Yes, that's true.
And then to complicate it more, this verse and many of the verses have traditions in their own right. The Bahir 1.7, Ecclesiastes 1.7 is already there. Mm-hmm, it's in the Gerona tradition, there's 1.4 and other verses. Mm-hmm. And they're all slightly different. Who's being aroused and how, and is it different in different contexts? Are there layers of arousal, and how does it relate directly to the verse itself?
Yeah, so I think I don't think there's any. I can't simply answer the question. I do remember that phrase that it's used in an isolated way in the Bahir, right? And it's I think one of those cases where Rabbi Rachumai teaches that darash, and he teaches that verse, and it stands independently. It's just there. I mean, how and why they just chose that verse or any of the verses that the Bahir chooses to give is often unclear. Presumably, there were fragments of verses that were being dealt with. In this particular, they don't use, as far as I recall, any term like that. This is a particular term that begins to emerge at this time of a kind of spiritual awakening, or there's an it's not. They don't use the language of illumination. There are other terms that could be used for that, but it is some kind of inner. They're using it for some kind of inner transformation as they are dealing with it. In that text, through that text, so that the work that Bay connotes is something of that exegetical energy that we don't understand. That verse itself, as they were studying it, tachaze, as they were contemplating it, aroused them in and through it to another level of consciousness. That's the only way I think I understand.
Maybe to say it slightly different way. So I want to see too. So how do I see? By contemplating the verse, and if I contemplate it properly, then I will arrive at that same vision or by learning how to see things the way that the Chevra see it, and how do I do that? So again, what is the method? To go back to Dove's question, and how does it work in my relationship to reading the Zohar itself, and then the Chevra's relationship to the biblical text? Is it layered like that, or are they opening up a direct access to the source that we can see? They do say Tachazeh, so come see. So we're participating in the experience in a way, perhaps.
Right.
It can lead us to get back.
I think that they want you to come and perceive, you too, to perceive that there's another layer. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But you're still on the outside of the Chevraya. Now, how the Chevraya come to this enthusiastic experience, or this enthused moment, is hard to say. It's the energy of that verse in the context of their spiritual meditation of it that becomes more than the verse. They understand in actuality that this is the truth of being. That's all that you could say. And you can't get there unless you get there. I mean, it's not, you can't prepare exegetically. You could know all the techniques, but knowing the technique simply means that you know that there's going to be some correlation between Scripture and the depths of reality. But what that would mean would depend on your inner spiritual training towards perceiving that. So a lifetime with the Chevraya would condition a deeper awakening. The only other thing that I do want to stress here, and that takes us in a very different dimension, is they live this mythic reality. This is the Hevraya, right? Presumably that this is a real Hevraya. Or it's the circle around the Zohar, or whatever kind of particular group was involved. This is not something abstract. This is a living, mythic, mystical reality that they are entering into. Scripture is a prism that is it. It's both a prism and it's it. So if you can enter the flow of the verse in the right way, you have in fact been transported there. They've lived a lifetime of study with each other. They have a certain temperament. There's a lot of training. But there is no open sesame because they debate with themselves whether they're really there. I think that all we can say from the authorial presentation of the text is that Rabbi Abba is showing us different levels of its comprehension. And he wants us to become aware that this is no ordinary passage. But I think everybody else is left on the outside as well. I would agree with my friend Liebes that you can't diminish the energy of the group. The energy of the group is part of what produced that spiritual dynamic. And something of that is reflected here. But what the energy of the group of shared study would be, we'll see in some other passages. They're sitting at night, and then all of a sudden they decide to go out in the fields. But there, what's also intriguing about this, particularly in the light of the Chagiga text of Ein Dorshan, you can't explicate in certain kind of groups, is they do explicate in groups. Mm-hmm. It's fundamentally opposite to the prohibition in the Mishnah. And it's precisely the spiritual group. Now the other thing that may weigh into this, and I think this would take us far afield, but also people like Liebes have suggested that some of the people in the group were believed to be avatars of different spherotic realities. So they would be particularly, on the basis of transmigration and a whole series of issues, their whole inner structure is related to certain features in the cosmos. And then they play off of each other in their discourse. I would tend to think that has some validity, but God only knows.
Just to add to your last comment, the verse I asked before, it relates to the Zohar comments exactly on the issue of the avatar.
Well, it deals with transmigration of souls.
Right, which is exactly that issue.
Yeah, we'll come to that much later in the thing. Yeah.
Just in terms of the question of the accessibility of what's happening, what's being described, given that we're dealing with an esoteric tradition, while it's clear that the exegesis is part of their mysticism, the act of exegesis, entering the flow of the text and the speculative and contemplative realities therein, there also might be techniques or preparations in some way which we don't have access to, which have not been promulgated or published. So that's also
right. Well, we do know some of them. For example, one of the techniques would be if you, and this was a very old technique, if you press on your eyeballs, there are flashing lights, right? Come on, you're showing your Iranian background, Leora. My goodness.
That's what kids do.
That's what kids do. Yeah, but this was actually, that's what kids do, but they don't do it for mystical reasons. Yeah, little kids do it, right? Little kids swim in the sea too, right? But it's a question of what your mind is when you're doing something, right? So, but they believed. It's a more complicated issue, but by pressing on the eyeballs, certain flashes of the upper levels of truth are disclosed. And they have other kinds of techniques that are referred to, but these would be parallel or preliminary. You're doing it. Are you getting there? Are you almost? Are you there yet? Are you there yet? No. Okay. You need a roadmap. Okay. But so it's complicated. Or let us say meditating on the colors of a flame. Right? I can't go into all of these, but you also have a certain supernal light that's over the aura of the flame. You have different colors. You have different understandings of the flow and the relationship between spiritual reality and physical, and how they interrelate, and different relationship between blue and red and white and the aura of white. So these are features that were obviously correlated with these deeper dimensions. Undoubtedly, these and many other techniques were practiced. But, I mean, how do you get into that space? Sometimes you're there and sometimes you're not there, right?
I have a question about what you said at the very beginning about the dangers of reveal the secrets.
Yeah, right.
What kind of dangerous it is? I mean that Maimonides also mentioned that you should not... Trivialization.
Okay. Pure... The danger is not... It's trivialization. You start talking about the erotic in the wrong way. You turn dynamic realities into fixed realities. You forget what's a metaphor and what's a spiritual truth. That's why I said in the beginning of that Idra Rabbah, where he says, a person who just prattles around reveals things. You have to know who you're talking to, when a person is ready to hear certain kinds of things. So the danger is that we're dealing with a certain level of consciousness that if you talk about it in mundane terms, it could sound ludicrous, or it could sound like it's not real. But for those who experience it as a spiritual reality, it was at a different order of consciousness. So they don't want people who are not ready for that kind of consciousness to read the text at the wrong literal or literalizing level, or the wrong metaphorical level, or get fixed on certain images, right? Or to turn the whole text into one code, and so on and so forth. And, I mean, that is...
So that kind of order of consciousness can be trained and ascending to the higher...
I have no doubt that it was. I mean, we know, let us say, from the Hevel Rabati, what the date of that may be. At least it's from maybe the 3rd century to maybe the 8th or the 9th, the Gaonic. I don't want to get into the debates over the thing. But it's a mystical text, but one of the features of that text is the precondition. The precondition is not only rabbinic learning, but it is highly trained ethical, spiritual purification of the self. Because you don't get even to this place until you go through all the levels of moral, spiritual, ethical training. You don't just go into a bookstore and a pogo vault into the upper spheres, right?
Yeah, but still...
reading the text is not a pogo stick, and that you bounce into another stratosphere. So in other words, all of this training is this slow cultivation with masters of the purification of the self, the purification of desire, And we see in some of the texts, if the mind wanders and has a false desire, the mystic falls down to earth. It's clear.
So the masters choose his students or not? That every student come to him, he will accept. Or not?
We don't know. Look, we don't know what this meant at this period. We do know what's recited about this in the 16th century. That is to say, the relationship between a master and a disciple is that they share the same soul root in the upper worlds. Otherwise, they couldn't communicate. That's why certain people can be friends and certain people can't be friends, right? That's why certain people choose certain therapists and not other therapists. They choose certain teachers and not others because there's a perceived understanding they come from the same soul root. Now that notion with Chaim Vital is a fundamental axiom of 18th century Hasidism as well. You understand your student because you understand the structure of their soul, because you come from the same place, but you've already perfected it. And so you only accept as students people you can really help, or you can perceive. Or you can perceive the flaw in a disciple because you understand the structure. Now, I have no doubt that these notions were much earlier, but they're only articulated by the 16th century.
So, at the bottom, my question is whether everybody is teachable to this kind of spiritual experience.
Of course not.
Not all? Yes. Yes or
No.
No.
Just look around.
Well, people under the age of 40.
No.
So there is some.
No, look, you have to get to a certain level of consciousness to even get there.
Yeah.
I think, look, I understand, I think at one level, the communicative level of the Zohar is saying to hoi polloi, there's more in these verses, Horatio, than you could have imagined. Right? But they're not telling you everything about that. The disciple, the Hevrayim know this. And they're simply telling you that there's just a lot there. And sometimes they'll tell you something that's not too wild. Like we'll talk about the Havalim, like maybe not today, but next time. But, and then you can hear it and really not understand what it means. Really understand what it means. So that's what he says. You can understand it with your outer eye, but you don't understand what it means. That's what he just told us that. You understand the outer eye, but you don't understand what the Chachmata Ilah is, what the supernal wisdom is. Or you understand the complexity of how streams can flow and congeal and then unfreeze. But what in heaven's name does that mean? And then all of a sudden you have a flash, right? And then you're inside the text because the text is the true reality, condensed in that verse. So I don't know, but not everybody can get there. So you have, and if from the outside it's ridiculous, because it's an internal mythic structure that is working with an inner map of consciousness, and unless you accept that map as truth, you can't go anywhere. It's with all. It's not as if there can't be multiple orders of maps of truth, but unless you accept the map as truth, you can't do anything. Yeah, that's the first decision.
You cannot accept it from outside.
And you can't accept it from outside. That is an ancient mystical axiom, right? You have to make a commitment that it will work or it won't work. It's a hermeneutical circle, but that's just the way it is. And then the only proof is if you get somewhere with it. But that people have discussed that in forever. But so there's no other way but entering the verse. And so, I'm not trying to trivialize it, but it's there are just different cognitive aptitudes, and or being evolved in different kind of ways. I guess this is taking us in different directions, but okay, yeah. Yeah.
About the philosophy of language that is presupposed to be working here, there is at all the philosophy of language and how it relates to the divine real. I mean, the presupposition is that God is creating the world through linguistic entities which are absolutely omnisignificant or hypersignificant.
Yeah.
So what is the breach that is separating?
Well, we'll see when we get to this thing about the Hevel that is one speculation about that. That Hevel is some kind of strange mixture between fire and moisture that produces voice, and that produces the articulation of existence. And to understand the mystery of breath is to take you back through articulated speech to the primal preform of speech, which is the Hevel, which is the primordial forming in the depths of becoming. And that's what we'll see. And that's what Solomon understood, and he revealed, and he learned it from his father. But he had to learn it again on his own, through his own inner truth, as we'll see that he will talk about that. So there is a mystery of speech, but speech has a preform. And the preform of what will be called kol, if kol is related to these correlations, kol is related to tiferet. It's a kind of creative energy. The preform would be higher than rucha, which may be chesed, is this issue of Hevel, which may in fact be bina. And it's the structure of what we would call the essence, the unfolding of the meaning of things that could cohere in any kind of meaningful way, right? And Hevel comes out of that particular place in wisdom. It's a deep wisdom that is. So Bina is a kind of feminine principle of birthing, of wisdom. That kind of a same notion is actually preserved in the Latin. When we say to think of something, we say to conceive a thought. It's a birthing of a thought. And Bina is that birthing of breath that becomes meaning in kol. And then at a lower level, there may be mila and dibur or whatever. But these are restructuring of language that appears in the Psalms, and they're trying to put them into some kind of theosophical hierarchy. In the Psalms, they don't appear that way, right? But there's an attempt to kind of have a mystical reordering of them, which would perhaps reflect some kind of a mystical attempt to understand the emergent structure from breath to sound to sense, right? So they are concerned with that. So by the time what we have at the level of Scripture is at that lower level of where all of this is actualized in a certain form of creative speech that creates this world. But it's not the only form of speech and language in the infinite, in infinitely imperceptible worlds that proceed.
Well, it's fascinating how they seem to do two things. Like in a way, they zoom in an amazingly powerful way, so that they actually give you what the very essence, the boiled down structures. On the other hand, it seems that they actually blow this structure out of proportion. They actually show the different facets and valences, so that it becomes pretty baroque.
Well, each verse is a mini myth.
Yeah.
Each verse is a mini myth. This verse that we just saw of all the streams flow into the sea is the myth of being.
Yeah,
it's the myth of being, but it's a myth that you narrate in consciousness to understand it.
Yeah, but then if you see that transparently, you see the underlying essence they want, the underlying structure which they want to convey through the myth, if you want.
Right. I would only assume that these, and this is only my own speculation, but to the degree to which they create these hierarchies, let us say from Dibur up to Kol, to voice, up to Rucha, to Hevel, whatever they're doing, are really for the sake of contemplative ascent. Right? I don't think it has really this. It's not an abstract notion of the ontology of how breath becomes sound, becomes voice, becomes actual speech. But you want to take things from their actualized point backward, because you're trying. This is that Neoplatonic aspect. You have the descensus and ascensus, or the regressus. You have to go back. To go back means you have to move from the material world backward. So to the degree to which they're doing that, these are stations of meditative consciousness for the abstraction of spiritual mind. So it's not an abstraction in the philosophical sense, it's an increasing abstraction of consciousness. So that you get back to no thought at the point that you go beyond Hevel as breath. Right?
But these are not simple exercises just for the sake of drilling. What I mean to say, you see this in Buddhist philosophy, they actually had deep insights about the way mind works. Right? So they were, because the...
Look, for all I know, these may have been part of the oral traditions that were passed on silently about these issues. We just don't know. Now, all that we can say is that we can see from the exegesis what was in the deep mystical consciousness that's coming to the surface. It's the same way if you're reading, for me, at least for me, reading the Midrash. Because the Midrash is so counterintuitive in many ways, you wouldn't know what the cultural unconscious is about a whole series of theological issues until the Midrash reveals something that is totally against the grain of the text. Right? But it was already there in the cultural mind. All of this material is already there in the mind of these mystical communities. It's only through the exegesis that we're able to see them allowing themselves to say it through the text. And so for them, this is the truth that's being revealed through exegesis. It's already there. More than that we can't say, because they guard the secret so seriously and they're so upset when people have revealed it. Then all of a sudden we have a text like this, which blows it into the open, and then we've just seen that they're saying nothing that you can really deal with. Ein Sof doesn't, these things, they're not referred to. And so they don't talk about Sfirot. You don't know what the coding is. You have... Right. Okay, I was going to say something, but I won't. Okay. No.
I'm silent.
Yeah. We probably can't do the Hevel thing, but I think next time we will pick up on that Hevel, because I do want to kind of focus. That'll be the third text, and we can see, maybe we can move on to the other material, or if we want to do one more. I don't want to linger too much, but I think we're beginning to see that... I think you should also, when preparing for next time, look at the very last one too, because the very last text I chose to kind of end it kind of correlates with the beginning, where there are 70 major aspects, and each aspect has an infinity number of colors and dimensions of every single word. So they're experiencing the plurivocity of mystical understanding. And that Scripture itself is not just the code, right? It is it's the way into the mythic dimension. But you can exist in that in innumerable ways. Even so, it's beyond. It's really truly beyond understanding. The only thing that I can really stress is that for them, this is the truth. This is not metaphor. They live inside this reality, and unless you accept that, you can't understand what they're doing. They are at a different order of mentality than we are. They truly live in this mystical, mythic universe. And I think, this continues right down to the 18th and 19th century Hasidism. In many of these texts, you think you're reading psychology, but they're in a different order of reality. It's just a totally different epistemology. And they are inside the myth. The Chazal, the sages, are inside metaphors. But the mystics are inside the myth. And the task is constantly to re-enter the myth through interpretation. I don't know any other way to... And they give you hints of that. But more than that, they don't. They don't cheat on themselves. They don't tell you more than you need to know.
Or even that.
Huh?
Or even that.
Yeah. That's all I can say. I mean, if anybody knows more, I'd be happy to learn. I just don't. There anything that. So just finishing this text, you see this, to the place where the streams flow, they continue to flow. Why they continue. So notice again, there is, just so that you can see, there is this constant return to the technical language of the text. Right? So you have two features which reflect very old forms of religious consciousness. Right? A, that the text of Scripture has a hypersignification. And the question is why Scripture, or the author of Scripture, or in this case the author of Scripture and Scripture is one and the same, because this is God, it's not just Scripture, right? We can't go into that, but they're entering into divinity. It's not like there's God and then there's this text. This is God, this is divinity, and they're into a certain kind of dimension of that. And then they want to understand, if they say why they continue, because you could simply say, to the place of the streams flow. What does this add? In other words, this is already a rabbinic notion. If a text is hypersignificant, every single integer is hypersignificant. And the divine authorship or divinity wouldn't reveal this aspect of God's self if it wasn't significant. So you have to stay with what looks to be a metaphorical redundancy because it isn't. It's telling something else. Right? So it's a much larger issue, but this is divinity in a form of manifestation. This is a manifestation of divinity as text. If you don't understand that, you're not inside it. Right? This language is God. Right? Torah v'Oraita v'Kuchabrichu chadhu. That is true. God, Israel, and Torah are one. And they're just different homologies of the same truth. And at the core is the divine name, which Ibn Shakatiya says quite clearly, that is the core of everything, and every single piece of language, we're talking about the mystery of language, is a part of a complex algorithm of those four letters. In ways that, so that is the core. And so you're not reading the text, you're entering into God. Okay, if that sounds weird, that's just the way it is. So reading is a form of spiritual avoda. It's a spiritual practice in which you enter into the divine being. And then you're interpreting within that. And either you're lucky with your consciousness or you're not. But if you don't understand that, this is just text out there, it's just language out there. This is God becoming language, becoming text. And you have to, this is an absolute spiritual, ritual experience. And what the Chevraya are doing, are performing a different form of spiritual exercise. It's not prayer, it's a spiritual exercise. Right? And if you enter the language, you are entering into the divine reality. That's that. If you don't at least perceive that from the outside, you can't perceive. You don't understand what's going on. There's no outside. There's only an outside of your alien consciousness, right? If I have to talk mystically around the table here, but that's it. There's no outside. Everyone's inside. It's just where your head is at in relationship to the inside. You're outside from the inside. And that's the false consciousness. Right? So that's what you need masters and disciples to get you there. But since it's God and it can be said in an infinite number of ways, the Chevraya are talking at that level. And they have to get themselves spiritually aroused for that. Or they can go nuts, right? As we know, they can go crazy, they just lose their mind. And we have 2 or 3 good examples of that. Because it bursts consciousness. Or you lose your mind is because you can't contain that mentality. But we have 3 or 4 powerful examples of that. Right? Ben Azai is chutz. He's a goner. That's what chutz is. He's gone. He's gone. He's lost it. But there are other cases where this issue is that you can't sustain. So all I want to emphasize here is this part of what we were saying is it's not just language. It's God, because God is language at this level, right? God is this language, and that's why these reticulations and correlations are part of this deeper flow of being. This is mystical stuff, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just text. So this is you, and that's why the external world is just another manifestation of that. That's why everything is correlated. From our consciousness, you're inside this and outside that. But these are all dimensions, trees in the text and trees in the outside world are just different configurations of the same reality. But their truth in infinity is not related to what a tree looks like, right? So they're trying to get you into that space, and that's what it means to be an interpreter. To me, it means to enter the divine reality totally, right? It's very far from rabbinic issue. It's a return to a deep mythic consciousness. I think in that sense, Shalom was absolutely right. The rabbinic consciousness of theism and duality is radically overcome with an absolutely absorbing mythic totality. And this is the reality that we live. This is it in this level of consciousness. So the hermeneutics of this is the hermeneutics of spiritual consciousness. That's right. That's for those who want to. That's why he says, "Who can understand this?" Right? They're saying this because they know that it's always partial and has to be done again and again and again. Miyachil liminda. Right. So more than that, I can't say. But this is the truth of this material. As long as we've got to this point of honesty, as I was, need to know basis. If it's okay, we'll do the Havalim next time. Would that be okay? And then can we talk a little bit about the breath and about the power of speech? But just read this. But read this as you enter. This is a spiritual opening. When he says so and so patach, that's the opening to enter in to that. And happy journeys. Okay, what? Yeah, right. This is so actually, just so you know, so people can understand, the study of this tikkun, the tikkun is not the Lurianic notion of repair, right? The word tikkun in the Zohar means to ornament. You ornament the bride through interpretation. That's why you study. You celebrate, you enter into the existence through tikkun, which means in Zoharic Aramaic, the ornamentation of the bride. Right? And that is that process it's a spiritual glorification through the entering of study as a form of ornamental celebration. That's what it is. That is the ritual act. That's what it is. So.
Why ornamental?
Huh?
Why ornamental? Why do you have to ornament the bride?
That is all that we can do. What else can you do? What else would you want to do? You put a crown, you get Murano glass, you do whatever you need to do. Right? What else would a person want to do?
Name some animals.
Hello?
The bride of the soul.
Have a hot dog?
Name some animals.
Right. That's it, folks. All right, so for those who it pertains, you all have a Kabbalah.
Soul, right?